Welcome back to my series, Tales of Bygone Years, where I'm talking about the princes of Kiev and Rus. Now, in my first video, I talked about Rurik, who was the founder of the Rurikid dynasty, although he was never actually Prince of Kiev. And in this video, I'm talking about Oleg, who was not a leg, but he was the first prince of Kiev proper. Now, Oleg enters the scene in 879 AD, when Rurik dies. His son Igor is too young to take the throne, so he bequeaths both the charge of his son Igor and the kingdom to his kinsman Oleg. And Oleg would have come over from Sweden to Russia either with Rurik or in a slightly later wave of immigration. But he was a first-generation immigrant. At this point, the Rus, which was the word for these Vikings who ended up in Russia, were not assimilated probably at all with Russian culture, and Oleg would have spoken a Scandinavian language, he worshipped Scandinavian gods, etc. And the Rus at this point were still a quite distinct ethnic group. And it's worth mentioning, by the way, that Russia at this moment is not a big center of civilization. So the image you should have in your mind is something more like the Wild West. There are a few busy trading posts like Novgorod. There were a few peripheral powers, so there were the Vikings in the northwest. There was Byzantium in the south, which the Russians called Tsargrad, which means the city of kings, wonderfully. There was the Khazarian Empire, where a lot of the Slavic tribes were paying tribute to them, and these were Muslim Jewish rulers. There were also the Volga Bulgars, who are east of what is now Bulgaria, and they are the people who had conquered what is now Bulgaria. So there were different groups of Bulgars at this point. There were also various powers elsewhere that didn't get too involved with the history of this region. There were also a number of tribes, many of which were Slavic, but many of which were also Finnic or Persian. So there isn't one big unified culture, and there isn't a big center of power within Russia. But Oleg was raring to go to fill this void. So he took the throne, he captured Smolensk, Lubeck, and then he went down to Kiev. And in my last video, I mentioned how two men from Rurik's retainer, Askell and Deir, had gone down to Kiev and set up shop there. So Oleg came, he had the young Prince Igor with them, and so I'm getting all my information in the primary chronicle. He explains that there's princely blood here and there isn't princely blood with them. Eventually he kills them and he becomes Prince of Kiev. And after that he goes around conquering Slavic tribes, and many of them, as I noted, had been paying tribute to the Khazarians, and he ended up taking their tribute, which it looks like was mostly furs. So lots of conquering, but Oleg was not done. And in 907 AD, he sailed down to Constantinople and attacked there. And it's not very clear if this was a real historical incident. Almost certainly it didn't happen the way it's described in the primary chronicle, where the Greeks were so overcome at every moment and they gave massive amounts of tribute, including, by the way, brocaded sails for the Rus when they sailed back and silk sails for the Slavs, which tore in the wind, so they replaced them with the canvas sails they had come with. But at the end of this, they signed a peace treaty which allowed trade between the Rus and Byzantium. And that part is probably historical to some degree. And there's also another interesting little detail in the primary chronicle which has to do with Oleg and an adjective that is associated with him, Vichy. And Vichy means prophetic. And by the way, there are two sh sounds in Russian, and I cannot pronounce them distinctly. So I'm using the one that is often transliterated like sh. So Vichy Oleg. But it means prophetic Oleg. And for some reason, Oleg is associated with prophetic powers. And this will come up particularly when we're talking about the story of his death in a moment, which is by far the most interesting part about him. But when he sailed into Byzantium, the Greeks sent some food, and Oleg prophetically was able to note that the food was poisoned and he didn't eat it, and the Greeks were amazed. But now it's time to talk about the only thing anybody really remembers about Oleg, which is the way he died. So the story goes that he approached a Volk, which is an impossible to pronounce word for a Slavic pagan priest, and he asks how he was going to die. And the Volk, the priest, responds that he is going to be killed by his horse. And he is sad to hear this, and he says, well, I'm not going to ride my horse anymore, and he puts it out to pasture. And after several years, after many of his conquests, he returns to the same place, and he's curious, where is his horse? How's he doing? And somebody tells him, well, your horse has died. And he says, oh, really? And he asks to go see the grave of the horse. And so he stands on the grave of the horse, and a snake crawls out of the skull and bites him, and the snake bite kills him. And this incident was immortalized by the great Russian poet Alexander Pushkin. And I would like to read a little passage from it, because it illustrates my favorite thing about this story, which is that Oleg did not consider killing the horse, rather he put it out to pasture. So this is just a little bit, and I'm going to read it in Russian. I'm not a Russian native speaker, so don't take my pronunciation as any kind of gospel, and I will translate it on screen. So. Прощай, мой товарищ, мой верный слуга, расстаться настало нам время. Теперь отдыхай, пусть не ступит нога в твое позлощение стремя. Прощай, утешайся, помни меня. Ветроки другие, возьмите коня. Покройте попоны, мохнатенько вон люб порубцы отведите. Купайте, кормите отборным зерном. Водой ключевою поите. So you'll see that he wanted the best for the horse, and the horse wanted the best for him too, but he couldn't help it, there was a snake in his skull. So that was the death of Oleg, again, 912 AD, and he was succeeded by Igor, and Igor will be the topic of the next video.